Appropriation in the State of Nature, Locke on the Origin of Property by Karl Olivecrona. In the discussion of John Locke's concept of property, which lies at the root of his political theory, controversy prevails. Laslet records it as the conventional judgment of Locke's view of property that it described a natural, inalienable right. This Laslet himself finds exactly wrong. It has been suggested that Locke used the term property in two senses, both in the narrow one of material belongings and in a more extended sense, including such ideal benefits as liberty and honor. But this distinction has been contested. With regard to the acquisition of property, there is some lack of clarity concerning the significance of the labor theory of value ascribed to Locke. As a contribution to the explanation of Locke's theory of property, I propose in this paper to discuss his view on the acquisition of property. His opinion in this respect has to be seen against the background of the doctrines of the great teachers of natural law in the 17th century. We know that Locke possessed the works of Grotius and Pufendorf on the law of nature and made use of them. He especially admired Pufendorf, whose great treatise De Jure Natura et Gentium in 1672 he described as the best book of its kind, better than the works of Grotius on War and Peace in 1625. Hobbes was of less importance for Locke. Pufendorf usually follows Grotius. His general view on the law of nature and the origin of rights is on the whole the same as that of Grotius. But regarding the introduction of the right of property, there are some differences of opinion which are not without significance for our subject. 1. The views of Grotius and Pufendorf. The starting point for Grotius and Pufendorf was the assumption of the original liberty of man. Liberty implied equality. Everybody was sovereign within his own sphere, but he must not encroach upon the sphere of others. To do so constituted an inuria. The fundamental precept of the law of nature, the will and command of God, was to accord to everybody what belonged to him. Sum cuique tribere. This was not a command to exert oneself on behalf of others. The precept had a purely negative significance, to refrain from causing injury to one's fellow men. That was to act justly. Grotius says that justice consists entirely in abstaining from taking that which belongs to others, alieni abstinentia. Thus, each individual was supposed to possess, in the state of nature, a sphere of his own. By Grotius, this sphere was called the sum, that which belongs to oneself. Every infringement on the sum was an inuria. The consequence of an inuria was that the principle of alieni abstentia was no longer applicable in favor of the aggressor. Without committing an injury, the offended person could now use violence against him to avert the attack, to recover what he had lost, or to extract compensation. The reaction need not be proportionate to the damage caused or threatened by the attack. If it was necessary to prevent an injury, even of the most trifling kind, the assailant might be killed. Everybody was, so to speak, surrounded by an invisible fence which marked off his sphere against others. If an intrusion was made or attempted, the invader forfeited the sacredness of his own person. He lost the protection of the fence and was nakedly exposed to the violence of the offended party. But in the state of nature, existence was precarious. Society was formed for the purpose of protecting the sum. The participants to the compact forswore the license of using force themselves. Vindicating the sum was entrusted to the community, acting on behalf of injured parties under the direction of the courts, exception being made only for situations where the community could not intervene. As will be seen, the two great principles governing relationships in the state of nature were the sacredness of the sum, on the one hand, and the license to react with violence against injuries on the other. The same principles obtained in society, but force had now to be used, on principle, by the community alone. The pivot of the system was the sum. Everything depended on how it was circumscribed. This was what gave substance to the principle sum cuique. We shall now see how Grotius and Pufendorf defined the sum. Since there was a certain difference of opinion between them, we had better first discuss Grotius alone. 1 continued, the sum according to Grotius. In the language of Grotius, the term sum meum nostrum denotes that which belongs to a person. An equivalent expression was to be proper to somebody, aliqui proprium esse. In the state of nature, that which belonged to an individual was, in the first place, his life, limb, and liberty, but also his reputation and honor. Consequently, every attack on the life, limb, liberty, reputation, or honor of somebody was an injury to him. Furthermore, the sum included one's own actions. They were coordinated by Grotius with body, limbs, reputation, and honor. Therefore, they were counted as belonging to a person in the same sense as his life and limb, etc. The positive content of liberty, libertas, was the power one had over one's own actions, potestas in se. But the power over a certain action could be transferred to another person. In this way, the sum of one person could be diminished and that of another correspondingly enlarged. The transference implied the establishment of a right for one person over another. The means of effectuating the transference was an act of will. Since the power over one's own actions resided in the will and everybody was sovereign within his own sphere, the will alone could detach part of its power from itself and bestow it on somebody else. But acceptance was necessary. The will of the recipient must be active in order to include the transferred power within its own domain. This was the import of a contract. The force creatrice in a contract was the will of the parties, but for practical reasons the inner action of will could not be sufficient in human relations. The will had to be made manifest in some appropriate way. A signum or declaratio voluntaris was necessary. A contract therefore was made up by 2 declarations of will, promise and acceptance. The promisor alienated part of his liberty and transferred it to the opposite party who took possession of it. The promisee thereby acquired the power over a certain action by the promiser. If the promiser, for instance, engaged to pay a sum of money, he lost the power of freely deciding whether or not to perform this act. The promisee could now request him or command him to do so. It then became necessary for the promisor to comply. The necessity was not of a factual kind. The promisor could actually refuse payment, but it was morally necessary for him to pay. He had deprived himself of the inner freedom to choose between different modes of acting. He was morally speaking in a state of subjection to the promisee. The latter held a moral power over him, a qualitas or facultas moralis. This was the significance of a right, ius, in the proper sense. All rights in the sense of moral faculties derived directly or indirectly from promises, that is, from acts of will through which parts of the original liberty were transferred to others. An exception was made only with regard to the right of parents over their children, which the parents possessed because they had generated the children. In the state of nature, there were no rights in the sense of moral faculties, except insofar as agreements had been concluded and parents had rights over their children. Everybody simply had his sphere of sum and was at liberty to vindicate it by force against actual or threatening aggression. But through agreements, the sphere of the sum could be extended so that it came to include more than life, limb, etc. Every facultas moralis that one had acquired through an agreement also belonged to the sum. The general rule of consequence of an inuria was applicable. Disobedience to the request of the possessor of a moral faculty was an injury done to him, and he was entitled to react with force, in society with the help of the courts. The connotation of the term sum was that which belongs to the personality: life, limb, liberty, reputation, honor, and the moral faculties over the other people acquired by agreements. The connotation of the word inuria was attack on the personality of somebody. The right of property was a moral faculty used against other people in requesting them to refrain from interfering with the object owned and to restore it if they had taken it. This right, like every other right, rested on an agreement. God had given to mankind all things and animals on earth to use. Originally, all men possessed everything in common. The right of property was introduced when this state of community of goods was found inconvenient. The agreement could either be an express compact to divide existing resources or a silent convention that everybody should have as his own what he had occupied. Evidently, what one acquired in one way or other was included in the sum. But even before the introduction of the right of property, the sphere of the sum could be enlarged. From God's original grant, it followed that everybody could take for himself what he desired and could consume. This general practice, Grotius says, filled the role of the right of property. If somebody had appropriated an object, it was an injury to deprive him of it. This sort of appropriation is only briefly mentioned by Grotius. He does not enlarge on this subject. It would seem as if he only had in mind taking things needed for immediate consumption or else for personal use. He does not explain how the appropriation was accomplished. The verb that he employed is aripere, not the technical occupare. He obviously means laying hold of something, taking it to oneself. This could not give rise to the right of property. A facultas moralis could only originate from an agreement. But the object possessed was included in the sum. Grotius here makes use of a natural and common idea. We can observe it in children. When a child has picked some strawberries, they are said to be his or hers. If they are taken from the child by a naughty boy, this is acutely felt, not only because of the loss of the strawberries. The act is experienced by the child as an attack on itself, that is, on its personality. In this way, we feel, all of us, with regard to objects that belong to us. They are supposed to be joined to ourselves. We have the feeling of our personality being in some inexplicable way extended to encompass the object we own. Therefore, if anything is taken from us or damaged, we have the experience of an attack on ourselves. The feeling differs, of course, in strength depending on the circumstances. It is especially pronounced with regard to cherished things in daily use or connected with memories. In the case of land, it can rise to a high degree of intensity. If a farmer is deprived of the soil which he and his forefathers have cultivated for generations, he will feel it as a severe amputation.